SpaceX bids goodbye to a venerable booster, a record-breaking year ends with amazing pictures from deep space, and Starship Flight 3's vehicles have completed testing. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF. It's Friday the 5th of January, and there's much more to come this week in Spaceflight. Happy New Year, everyone, and I hope you had a fantastic holiday season because we had a ton of cool stuff happening at the end of 2023. And you got a little bit of a peek of that during the intro. Now, just one of these very cool things was the flyby of NASA's Juno spacecraft near Io, one of the 4 Galilean moons of Jupiter. This flyby brought us some amazing new imagery of the most geologically active body in the solar system. Juno's flyby was part of its 57th periapsis around Jupiter. This is the part of the orbit where Juno is closest to the largest planet in the solar system. Juno's orbit is a highly elliptical one to avoid the spacecraft staying for too long within the higher radiation environment, while at the same time allowing it to be used to study Jupiter's interior. For the last 2.5 years, Juno has been using Jupiter's major moons to be able to progressively shrink the orbit to get closer to Jupiter and also to gather data for the upcoming JUICE and Europa Clipper missions. While the spacecraft had performed an Io flyby in July, this was its closest yet, with the closest approach being just 1,500 kilometers away from the moon. The views captured by Juno Cam show the surface of its moon patched with several volcanoes and flows of lava all across it. Another picture was able to capture the reflected sunlight on Jupiter shining on the shadowed side of the moon. Now, as is usual with every periapsis around Jupiter, JunoCam also captured views of the cloud tops of Jupiter's atmosphere and the dazzling shapes and colors that result from the different cloud bands interacting with each other. Another close flyby of Io is expected to occur on Juno's next orbit on February 3rd, which will again bring the spacecraft within 1,500 kilometers of its surface. So you can bet we'll check back in a month to see what other cool stuff Juno has discovered. And now let's take a look at the last 2 weeks in launches. We've got a lot to catch up on since our last episode. Starting off the long string of launches, we had a Falcon 9 rocket lifting off on December 23rd at 5:33 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. It was carrying a batch of 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage for this mission, B1058, was flying for a 19th time, breaking the record number of flights for a booster. And while it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions, it later tragically tipped over on the way back to Port Canaveral due to some rough weather out at sea. When coming into port, only the remains of its RP-1 tank and engine section remained on the deck of the drone ship, and the booster's iconic NASA worm logo, located on its LOX tank, has sadly been lost at sea. Various SpaceX officials took to social media to further explain the issue. Kiko Donchev, SpaceX's vice president of launch, said that when there are uneven loads on the landing legs, securing a booster with Octograbber, the Falcon 9 securing robot on SpaceX's drone ships, is very challenging. SpaceX had confirmed earlier that newer Falcon boosters are equipped with upgraded legs that are capable of self-leveling, and therefore should be able to mitigate this uneven load issue. As to the fate of B1058, SpaceX's Vice President of Falcon Launch Vehicles, John Edwards, said that the company is planning to salvage the engines and do inspections on the record-breaking booster to learn from it. B1058's sacrifice will not be in vain. Another Falcon 9 launch took place on December 24th at 1311 UTC from Space Launch Complex 4 East in California. The rocket was carrying the Sarah 2 and Sarah 3 satellites into a polar orbit. The Sarah 2 and Sarah 3 satellites are part of the Sarah reconnaissance satellite constellation being set up by the German armed forces. The previous Sarah 1 satellite was also launched on another Falcon 9 back in 2022 from the same Vandenberg launchpad. Also like that mission, the first stage returned back to land at Landing Zone 4. In this case, the booster was B1075 flying for its 8th mission. The next few launches after that occurred all from China, with the Kuaizhou 1A lifting off on December 25th at 1 o'clock UTC from Site 95A at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying 4 Tianmu-1 satellites into a sun-synchronous orbit. The Tianmu-1 satellites are small satellites dedicated to weather research using GPS-like radio signals. The satellites are built by Xiyang Microelectronics Park, a subsidiary of the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. After that, on December 25th at 22:39 UTC, we had the launch of a Changzheng 11 from the Bo Run Jiuzhou barge located off the coast of China. The rocket was carrying 3 Xi'an-24C satellites into a sun-synchronous orbit. This was the 5th launch of the Changzheng 11 from a barge at sea. A Changzheng 3BE with the Yuanzhong 1 upper stage was launched just a few hours later on December 26th at 3:26 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. It was carrying 2 BeiDou-3 global positioning satellites into a medium Earth orbit. The 2 satellites are the 25th and 26th BeiDou-3 satellites to reach medium Earth orbit, with at least 4 others already located in geosynchronous orbit. Another Kuaizhou 1A launch took place on December 27th at 6:50 UTC from Site 95A at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying another 4 Tianmu-1 satellites into a sun-synchronous orbit. This was the shortest time between launches of the Kuaizhou 1A rocket, with just over 2 days in between them. Just 13 minutes later, from Russia, we had the launch of a Soyuz 2.1V rocket, with liftoff taking place on December 27th at 7:03 UTC from Site 43-4 at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. The rocket was carrying a classified payload for the Russian Ministry of Defense into a sun-synchronous orbit. Due to the classified nature of the launch, not much is known about it other than that it was given the designation of Cosmos 2574 once it reached orbit, as is usual for these payloads. Heading back to the US, we had the final 2 launches by SpaceX in 2023, and both happened in a record amount of time in between each other. The first of these 2 was the launch of a Falcon Heavy, which took place on December 29th at 1:07 UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. The rocket was flying as part of the USS F-52 mission for the US Space Force. The mission saw the 7th launch of Boeing's X-37B spaceplane on another secretive mission in orbit. This orbit, as usual, was not disclosed, but based on hazard notices for the launch and the re-entry of the second stage, it's believed that the X-37B might have gone into a highly elliptical and highly inclined orbit. This would explain why, for this mission, it was a Falcon Heavy launching it, when prior launches of the spaceplane had been carried out with the lowest performance configuration of Atlas V and on a Falcon 9 Block 4 with RTLS booster landing. For this mission, the Space Force used the second X-37B vehicle in its inventory, which had previously launched 3 times on the 2nd, 4th, and 5th X-37B missions. It was also the second flight of the X-37B, carrying an additional service module on the back that also allows it to carry extra payloads and propulsion systems. As usual with Falcon Heavy launches, the side boosters were reused from previous flights. This was the 5th flight for B-1064 and B-1065, and they successfully landed back on land at SpaceX's Landing Zone 1 and Landing Zone 2. These are now set to be reused again later this year to be flown in expendable mode on the launch of NASA's Europa Clipper mission in October. SpaceX launched another Falcon 9 just a few hours later from the neighboring Space Launch Complex 40 launch site with another batch of 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites heading to low Earth orbit. Liftoff took place on December 29th at 4:01 UTC, breaking SpaceX's record for shortest time between launches at 2 hours, 54 minutes, and 40 seconds. This was also the shortest time between any launches from the Cape since the Gemini program in the 1960s. The first stage for this mission, B-1069, was flying for a 12th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. This was SpaceX's 96th and final launch of a Falcon rocket in 2023. But it was not the final launch of the year overall. We also had a Changzheng 2C rocket with the Yuanzhong 1S upper stage lifting off on December 30th at 13 past midnight UTC from the South Launch Site 2 at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying 3 test satellites for China's SatNet internet satellite constellation into low Earth orbit. This was the 222nd and final launch of the year, wrapping up a record-breaking 2023. Here are the launch statistics of the year, and as you can see, we had a lot of activity from the US and China. Maybe let us know in the comments if we should do a worldwide stats update every episode, or maybe every month perhaps, but we think it'd be interesting to track this over the year. And also, we know you guys sometimes ask about Starlink stats. Well, in 2023, SpaceX launched 1,984 Starlink satellites across 63 missions. Next, 2024's launches started off from India, with the launch of a PSLV-DL rocket on January 1st at 3:40 UTC from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. The rocket was carrying the XPoSat Space Observatory into a sun-synchronous orbit. XPoSat is India's latest X-ray observatory. Its name stands for X-ray Polarimeter Satellite, and as it implies, it's dedicated to the study of the polarization of X-rays coming from distant sources in the universe. It also sports an X-ray spectroscopy payload that will enable it to characterize the type of source causing these X-rays. Along for the ride on this launch was also the third PSLV Orbital Experimental Module, also known as POEM. This module is essentially the fourth stage of the PSLV rocket that remains in orbit and either hosts or deploys other payloads after the main mission is done. For this flight, POEM-3 was carrying 10 payloads, and it maneuvered into a lower altitude and orbital inclination after it had deployed XPoSat. Of course, SpaceX's start of 2024 was with none other than a Starlink mission lifting off on January 3rd at 3:44 UTC from Space Launch Complex 4 East in Vandenberg. The mission carried a batch of 15 Starlink V2 mini satellites and the first 6 Starlink satellites with direct-to-cell connectivity. These Starlink DTC satellites feature a deployable antenna that connects directly to satellites just like ground antennas would, while laser transmitters and receivers on the satellites connect to the regular Starlink constellation. This essentially allows phone users to connect to Starlink without the need of a special antenna. This direct-to-cell service only provides low data rates though, and it's only really meant to be used in remote locations where no cell service is available. Initial deployment of this service will allow text messaging, with possible voice and data connectivity later down the line as more satellites are launched. The first stage for this mission, B-1082, was a new booster, which now joins the SpaceX West Coast fleet. It successfully landed on Of Course I Still Love You, but you can bet it read the instructions before its first landing. With all of the Starlink launches in the last 2 weeks, SpaceX now has launched a total of 5,671 Starlink satellites into orbit, of which 382 have re-entered and 4,600 have moved into their operational orbit. To wrap up this long list of launches, we also had another Falcon 9 launch on January 3rd at 23:04 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The mission was carrying the Ovzon-3 satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit. The Ovzon-3 satellite is Sweden's first communications satellite, and it was built and manufactured by Maxar for Ovzon AB, a Swedish communications company. The satellite's low mass of 1,800 kilograms allowed this launch to feature a return-to-launch site landing of the booster despite the high-energy orbit. The booster, B-1076, was flying for a 10th time on this mission, becoming the 12th booster to reach 10 flights. As mentioned, it successfully landed back on land at SpaceX's Landing Zone 1 ground pad, which, by the way, still had one of the side boosters from USS F-52 hanging around at the booster stand near Landing Zone 2. Okay, so that was a lot of launches to go through, but that wasn't all of the action that we were able to see at the end of 2023. In very SpaceX fashion, the company wrapped up the year with even more Starship testing, and it was pretty impressive. Now, prior to that, we had already seen a spin prime test and a static fire test of Ship 28 at suborbital Pad B, and then after that, we had an abort of Booster 10's 33-engine static fire test. This led to a series of tank farm tests and further launch pad preparations after Christmas. So of course, when Highway 4 was closed on December 29th, we were expecting a static fire test of Booster 10. What we didn't expect, though, was that Ship 28 would also be readied for another static fire test. The ship performed a single-engine static fire test that SpaceX said demonstrated, quote, a flight-like startup for an in-space burn. Now this is interesting, as it could mean that Ship 28 may be performing another burn in space after completing its main ascent. It could also just be another ground test unrelated to its actual flight that SpaceX used to gather more data for future flights. I mean, after all, Ship 26 did a similar test, and it doesn't look like it may be used for a flight anytime soon. But the star of the show that day was not Ship 28, but rather Booster 10, which performed a 33-engine static fire test just less than 2 hours after Ship 28's static fire test. SpaceX didn't give many details about the test other than it had ignited all 33 engines. If all stayed lit through the test, that would mean that this was the first static fire test where a super heavy booster ignited all 33 of its engines and they all stayed lit. But sadly, we have no further information from SpaceX, so we really don't know. These two tests now completed the standalone testing of Booster 10 and Ship 28, and they've been rolled back to the production site to get readied for flight. That flight could come within the next few weeks, so we'll keep an eye out for the usual hazard notices like NOTAMs, NOTMARS, and the long list of other indicators that we tend to look for. The next time Booster 10 and Ship 28 come back to the launch site, it could very well be for final checkouts and stacking. And while standalone testing is complete, they could still be tested again in stacked configuration, perhaps even with a wet dress rehearsal ahead of flight. Now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. On the last episode of This Week in Spaceflight, we featured the fourth launch of Firefly's Alpha rocket and its Fly the Lightning mission. However, at the time we recorded and published the video, we weren't really aware that the mission hadn't gone exactly according to plan. Some few hours after launch, tracking from the US Space Force had shown the payload and second stage were in a lower orbit than expected. Then, later in the day, Firefly posted on social media about the issue. The company stated that, quote, Alpha's scheduled Stage 2 engine relight did not deliver the payload to its precise target orbit. So while Alpha did put the satellite in orbit, it was not able to put it on its intended final planned orbit. Now this is reminiscent of Alpha's second launch when the second stage also failed to properly relight and put its payload into its proper final orbit. So for now, we'll just have to wait to see what Firefly finds out from this issue and when Alpha will be able to launch again. The Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency has set February 15th as the date for the second launch of its H-3 rocket. If you remember from last year, this rocket debuted for the first time back in March of 2023. While the first stage flight of the rocket went well, the second stage of flight didn't go so well, and the launch resulted in a failure. This prompted a failure investigation that has spanned well over half a year. JAXA says H-3 readiness for its second flight is now close enough to be able to announce its launch date. The roughly 3.5-hour launch window for this launch is set to open on February 15th at 22 minutes past midnight UTC. China has completed the construction of the country's first commercial launch pad. The main contractor for this project was the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or CASC, a state-owned company in charge of the development and construction of many of China's space projects. Now this one in particular started in 2022 as a result of the growing demand in launch capacity from commercial satellite operators. This newly built launch pad is located near the Wenchang Space Launch Site on the northeast coast of Hainan Island, with this new launch site being denoted as the Wenchang Commercial Space Launch Site. This commercial launch pad is the first of at least 2 planned to be built here and should be capable of supporting 16 launches of the Changzheng 8 rocket every year. The second launch pad is already under construction, and it should be able to support a much more varied number of rockets and a much higher launch cadence than the first one. And now let's take a look at what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, we'll once again have back-to-back Falcon 9 missions. The first one, Starlink Group 635, is set to occur from Florida, launching within a 4.5-hour window that opens on January 7th at 2100 UTC. The second one, Starlink Group 710, will be launching from Vandenberg and is currently set to occur within another 4.5-hour window that opens on January 8th at 5 o'clock UTC. And just a few hours after that, we'll have the debut flight of United Launch Alliance's Vulcan Centaur rocket from Space Launch Complex 41 in Florida. The instantaneous launch window is set for January 8th at 7:18 UTC, and as usual, we will be covering it live as it happens. Backup opportunities are available for this launch around the same time of night on January 9th, 10th, and 11th, so ULA will have 4 tries to get this mission off the ground before they need to hit the next lunar window for the Peregrine lunar lander that's riding on board. Later in the week, and from the other side of the world, we'll have another 3 launches, 2 from China and another one from Japan. The first one from China will see the debut flight of Orion Space's Gravity 1 rocket from off the Chinese coast. The 6-hour launch window is currently expected to open on January 9th at 3 o'clock UTC. The other one from China will likely feature a Laishun 1 rocket launching for a 3rd time, although the payload is currently unknown. The 6-hour launch window for this mission is set to open on January 10th at 2 o'clock UTC. And from Japan, we'll have the launch of an H-IIA rocket carrying the 8th optical intelligence gathering satellite for the Japanese government. The 2-hour launch window is currently scheduled to open on January 11th at 4 o'clock UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. We'll see you all again next week to recap This Week in Spaceflight.